Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Book Trek 2021. This is a 5-month mission I'm embarked on with a bunch of other booktubers where we're reading Star Trek fiction for the rest of the year. We spent August reading the original series, and that was mother's milk to me. I know those books well. I bought them eagerly as soon as they came out. I know the original series well and all of the movies. I eagerly followed all of that. But all good things, so to speak, come to an end. And now we move on for the month of September to Star Trek The Next Generation, which was created by Gene Roddenberry, the same creator of Star Trek, the original series, but 20 or 30 years after the first series, and designed to be a market break with that series. It takes place almost 100 years in the future of Kirk and Spock and McCoy. The ship is still the Enterprise. It's the Enterprise registry number D, 1701D, implying that there have been at least 3, maybe 4, or even 5 Enterprises between Kirk and the current Enterprise. And the current Enterprise is a very different thing. Not only is the design different and worse in every conceivable way, but the ship is enormously bigger. Enormously more powerful, as you'd expect. Imagine a warship today and compare it to a warship 100 years ago. There'd be no comparison whatsoever. The ship is enormously bigger. It's 1,000 people instead of 430 that are on board. I think originally, if I remember correctly, the missions were supposed to be 10 years long instead of 5, something like that. So that because the environment was so long term, the Enterprise D has not only its crew, but also their families are on board. As sort of, I guess, Gene Roddenberry's nod to the fact that the Federation is an exploratory and scientific endeavor, not a military one. The Enterprise is not a warship. So you can have families on board, spouses, children, presumably people who don't have any employment other than being the spouse. I mean, in Star Trek The Next Generation, we see lots of examples where one serving crew member, is married to another serving crew member. One will be a security officer, one will be working in a science lab. But presumably, that's not usually the case. Presumably, there are large numbers of family members who just live on board the ship and don't actually contribute to it in any way. It's not really explored in Star Trek The Next Generation, certainly not right off the bat. Instead, we're concentrating, as the original show did, on the bridge crew. Not on all the department heads that don't ever go to the bridge. Not on any of the office politics that are going on in all of those departments. You have to assume that even the captain and the first officer would know very little about what goes on in those departments, any more than the supervisors usually do. They would get updates and reports and whatnot, and that would be the extent of it. It's much harder to maintain the feeling that Gene Roddenberry and the cast of the original series created of the crew being a family. It's much harder to maintain that if it's 1,000 people. And as I mentioned, the ship design is much worse. Instead of having the gorgeous, graceful lines of the original Enterprise, the thing is flat-bottomed with a kind of horseshoe that holds the warp nacelles. The warp nacelles themselves are flat. And worst of all, there's a coward bridge. The front, the big saucer section of the ship is designed so that it can detach from the rest of the ship and presumably flee, leaving everyone else on board. It's a horrible. First of all, it doesn't make much in the way of mechanical sense as far as I can think of mechanics, but also it's just a horrible idea on every conceptual level too. It mystified me when I learned of it. Far more sensible, I think, is, for instance, the design change that was made in Star Trek Voyager, where we learned that the starship, USS Voyager, is capable of landing on a planet. It has landing gear, and it is built to withstand the stress of entering an atmosphere, something that neither the Enterprise nor the Enterprise D are able to do. So 100 years have passed. Almost 100 years have passed. Almost a full century. Starfleet is still here. The Federation is still here. The Enterprise is still here. And comparatively very little has changed. I remember watching the first episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation, thinking I'd been prepped by Starlog and all the industry magazines to think, okay, well, this is 100 years in the future, so things will be radically different, and they weren't. They aren't radically different at all, except the differences that are foreshadowed in some of the movies. The Klingons are no longer the enemy. The Klingon Empire and the Federation have a truce. They are allies. But the Romulans is still there. The Federation borders don't seem to have changed all that much. Federation size and mission doesn't seem to have changed all that much. I guess maybe on one level that's believable because we're being told that the Federation is an incredibly enlightened, wealthy, and stable society. So maybe it wouldn't change all that much in 100 years. The Enterprise D is commanded by a very different figure than Jim Kirk. I can't help but think that every single element of this original design of the bridge crew was intentional on Roddenberry's part and the part of some of his writers. He got together some great writers from his old show, along with new showrunners, to pull together all the ideas of what this new iteration of Star Trek would be like. Captain Jean-Luc Picard, the captain of the Enterprise, is an older man, far more sober, no hint of the Lothario, no hint of impulse or passion at all. And I guess I could sort of understand that. I was certainly happy when they got Patrick Stewart for the role. That's terrific. But the rest of the bridge crew, the rest of our central cast of characters, they raise many more questions than they answer. Almost all of them do. We can start with the weakest examples. For instance, the chief medical officer on board the ship is Beverly Crusher, and she has a tangled relationship with Jean-Luc Picard, a tangled relationship involving her dead husband, a tangled relationship that the more we learn about it, the more certain I am that either Picard would have refused to let her serve on the Enterprise, or she would have refused to accept the transfer, that just professionally they wouldn't work together. She also has her son, Wesley, on board the ship. Like I said, families and children are on board this vessel, but Wesley seems to interact with the command level. He seems to be on the bridge, including at the beginning of the show when he simply shouldn't be. You have Tasha Yar. She is the head of security on board the ship. She should be every single time telling little Wesley, no, sorry, you should be meeting him at the turbolift door saying you can't come on board. You can't come on board the bridge. This is the most sensitive area of the ship. You're no more allowed here than you're allowed in engineering. And engineering brings up another example of a character that raises more questions than they answer, in the chief engineer on board the vessel, Geordi LaForge, played by LeVar Burton. Geordi LaForge was born blind and has a visor, a metal vision amplification unit, where his empty eyeballs would be, I guess. And in the early parts of the show and in the book that we're looking at today, we're told that visor connects directly to his optic nerve and can see in microscopic detail, in infrared, in ultraviolet, in a far greater frame rate than the human eye, far greater. The optic nerve, the human optic nerve, can handle a lot more input than the human eye can give it. And this visual unit over his eyes that looks a lot like Cyclops' visor from the X-Men, and hence it's called a visor, allows Geordi to do all of that, which raises all kinds of questions. It raises all kinds of questions. Like, for instance, is he the only one in the Federation who has one of these things? Or more to the point, is he the only one in Starfleet who has one of these things? Why aren't they mandatory for Starship engineers? Why wouldn't that be? And don't tell me that it would be inhuman. Plenty of plebes at Starfleet Academy would gladly give up their sight for an improvement on their sight and a chance at being... an engineering cadet who had this kind of contraption over his eyes would have an unbelievable advantage over all other cadets. Geordi apparently had this thing when he was at the academy. So he was able literally to see things that his classmates couldn't see. How is that fair? Ditto for a number of other people. A number of other people in this core crew, like, for instance, my biggest bugaboo at the beginning of the show, Commander Data. One of the bridge crew is an android. Now, if in the novel, I'm reading today to start off Book Trek 2021 for September. I'm reading David Gerrold's novelization of the first episode, Encounter at Farpoint. And I understand that I shouldn't be holding the rest of the show to the standard of this book. And vice versa. I shouldn't be holding this book to the rest of the show. For instance, obviously, Gerald is working off incomplete scripts. He's working off stuff that was the production design was working on, but that wouldn't end up finished on the screen, and also that wouldn't end up being canon. I remember this from the first episode where Data makes a reference. There are references to the fact, hints and allusions to the fact that Data, the android on the bridge of the ship, was created by aliens, which would be bad enough. But the later on massaged and improved version of his origin, that he was created by a human, is even worse. And he has a duplicate. There is another Data, Lore, who again, I want to point out, like with Geordi's visor, I want to point out that would radically change things. Why would Starfleet Academy allow an android to be presumably a cadet, and then in officer training, and then posted on different vessels, and finally on the flagship of the Federation? Why? Why would that be? Data is incredibly strong, far stronger. He's as strong as a machine. He's far stronger than any of the humanoids around him, far faster, far better at everything that he does. So the question becomes the same as with Geordi's visor, only on a larger scale. If you're going to allow this android to be in the Federation, then why isn't all the Federation androids? There's a very complicated attempt to sort of retrofit the whole concept as to why Data's creator made 2 of them and not 50,000 of them. Why? I realize it's Gene Roddenberry's enlightened future. But in this enlightened future, the Federation has been through the ringer a number of times, on a number of different occasions, including facing technological threats that almost wipe out the human species. That's happened many times by the time where this is set, in the 24th century. So I don't think there's any chance whatsoever. It just doesn't seem believable to me that the Federation wouldn't say to Data, Cadet Data, I mean, he was this size. He was a grown adult when he was a cadet at the Academy. Surely that breaks rules right there. But it doesn't seem to me that there's any way that the Federation of the 24th century wouldn't have looked at Lieutenant Data or Commander Data and said, we're really, really grateful for your service. We'll send you back to the Enterprise and to your duties there in just a minute. But first, we're going to use your off switch. Data has an off switch located in his back somewhere. Fairly easy to get to. One wrong fling against a piece of equipment on the bridge, and your helmsman would be inactive, a lump, a toaster. This Federation of the 24th century would say to this Data character, okay, well, you can go back to the Enterprise and serve. We're grateful for your service, but first we're going to hit your off switch. We're going to reverse engineer you on a table and build 50,000 of you. we're certainly going to be able to know everything about you. We're not going to put, in other words, privately made, copyright retaining prototype technology on the bridge of a starship. We're not going to do it. You're co-optable. To say nothing of anything else, since you are an android and not a biological organism, you're co-optable. You can malfunction. We don't know what your creator put in you and didn't put in you. If we did know that, we'd have more of you, and we don't. I know that some ramifications of those questions are addressed in Star Trek Picard, but that happens, a century after, many, many decades after this show came out. So I saw that, I thought, okay, well, that's intriguing, but there's no way at all. Jared was a super strong, super fast, super smart android on the bridge of your starship. That's just asking for trouble. The same thing with the ship's counselor, Deanna Troi, who is half Betazoid, and therefore is not a full telepath, but is an empath, is able to sense the emotions of all those around her. When I watched the first episode a million years ago, I had the exact same question that every other original series fan I knew had. And we all asked it instantly, in unison. If you'd been in orbit, you would have been able to hear that question. What is the ship's counselor doing on the bridge? Not only on the bridge, but with an equal sitting to the captain and the first officer. I'm okay with the first officer being directly next to the captain on the bridge. I don't think it makes a whole lot of tactical sense, but I'm okay with that. But why is the other part of that trinity the ship's counselor instead of the ship's engineer, for instance? Or why is the ship's counselor on the bridge at all? Never understood that. Never makes any sense. Deanna Troi, the ship's counselor in question here, is totally useless in almost every way. Even down to her specific paranormal ability. She doesn't seem to be able to sense emotions when it might do anybody any good. And also, on the bridge, there's a Klingon. Lieutenant Worf is a bridge officer on the flagship of the Federation. Now, the Klingons, like I said, have been at peace with the Federation for a long time. Since Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, when James Kirk helps to break down barriers to pave the path for a peace treaty with the Klingon Empire. We get the strong impression, both in the episode and in this book, that Worf is the only Klingon serving in Starfleet. Why would that be? After so much time, why would that be? That didn't strike me as very believable, but I liked the idea of it. I liked the potential involved. And then, last but not least, and the focal point of a lot of Encounter at Farpoint, is Will Riker, the first officer, Picard's first officer. A rank and a function that was blurred almost out of existence in the original series. It's almost hard for people to remember who don't really know their Star Trek that Mr. Spock was not just the science officer of the Starship Enterprise, he was also the first officer. He was Kirk's number one. And served both those functions. That seems, in retrospect, a little unbelievable, especially since in the Enterprise of Captain Pike, we know that he did have a number one. That concept in Star Trek The Next Generation, I remember loving. Yes, of course, yes. You would have an officer, the highest ranking officer on the ship aside from the captain, who would be the captain's first officer. So, a sounding board, a devil's advocate, shoulder to cry on, repository for second-tier commands. I'm going to give the big picture commands. You're going to make sure they're followed out by giving all the individual departmental commands. Perfect sense. And William T. Riker seems like a throwback to the original series. He seems far more personable than any of the other characters. He seems to have an outgoing, normal Gene Roddenberry-style personality in a way that I really liked. And I'm grateful to say, in a way that is never betrayed. In the whole course of the show, it is never betrayed. Riker is always Riker. And he's always terrific. You can root for him. He's an old-fashioned 1960s TV-style hero. And we'll not hear anything about making that complicated or problematic or anything like that. I practically jumped off the couch up in Vermont cheering at the great scene that Riker gets at the conclusion of the first season of Star Trek Picard. Naturally, since so many characters are subverted or weakened or apologized for in Star Trek Picard, I assumed Riker would be high on the list. And instead, he gets one of the greatest Star Trek moments in modern memory. So I was very, very happy to see that. But I was happy with him all throughout the show. I thought it was the show did a really good job of making him not quite the captain. And the relationship between him and Picard I really liked. I couldn't say that about all the relationships on board this ship in the first few seasons of The Next Generation, which were all it took really to solidify my opinion against this show, was those first few seasons. And over the decades, I have talked to Star Trek The Next Generation fans who've told me in unison, without knowing each other, that the show gets much better after those first few seasons. And then I've been talking with my Book Trek co-hosts who say the same thing. That the show really comes into its own after a few seasons, including, scandalously, the possibility that it comes into its own only after Gene Roddenberry has exited. That would be amazing. Although, I gather over the years I've heard all sorts of interviews, read all sorts of testimony of what Roddenberry was like in the early days of The Next Generation. And it doesn't exactly do him any credit. It doesn't cover him in glory. So maybe that's what the show needed. Naturally, it makes an original series fan like me think about what would have happened if the original Star Trek had run for 7 seasons. Imagine if things like Amok Time or Journey to Babel or City on the Edge of Forever were the best episodes of the show before it found its strength. Imagine what the strength would be like. I don't know. and I am prepared to be very forgiving of a lot of the initial iterations of Star Trek The Next Generation, including this novel. This is a novelization of the first episode of the show. The novelization is by David Gerrold, who wrote the original series episode The Trouble with Tribbles, that is ordinarily found in anybody's top 5 list of best original Star Trek episodes. It's hilarious. It shows you what you get if you give Shatner comedy to do. He's okay with drama, but he's very much of the tell, don't show school of acting, leading man acting, that was already falling out of favor in the 1960s. Drugstore Cowboy and whatnot it was already falling out of favor, and Shatner never bothered to relearn it. But when it comes to comedy, he's spot on all the time, just perfect when it comes to comedy, as you can see in all of his later work, and as you can see in The Trouble with Tribbles, he is just perfect in that show. David Gerrold himself is not a particularly talented writer. I made the mistake, based on my affection for The Trouble with Tribbles, of reading his science fiction over the decades, and it's terrible. Absolutely wretched. He's a hack, in the worst sense of the word, and he doesn't exactly show anything otherwise in this book. I'm not willing to criticize him a lot for what I see in this book, because he had to be facing probably the mother of all tight deadlines, and he was working off somebody else's ideas. He was working off a script. Who knows what he would have written on his own? He does the best he can with this book. It is the story, on one level, of a pre-warp society world that somehow has one of the most advanced space dock facilities that the Federation is aware of, and the Federation sends the Enterprise under Captain Picard to find out why. How could that be true? Where does this Farpoint station come from if the people on the planet down below can't possibly have built it? But before that mission really unfolds, another thing is thrown in. Deus Ex Machina is thrown in. A being called Q, immortally, no pun intended, played by John Delancey, shows up on the bridge of the Enterprise, appears out of nowhere. He appears to be all-powerful. He's an energy-wielding being. He can teleport. He can change his appearance. He can set up force fields. He can do pretty much anything he wants, alter the shape of space and time, whether that's an illusion or not, and can presumably destroy the Enterprise. So his proclamation to Picard et al. On the bridge of the ship is that humanity has gone too far and must retreat back into its own borders, must not continue exploring, must not continue adventuring, and seems to have the power to back it up, to confine humanity. This is also a dumb idea, obviously. Does Q say this to the Romulans? Does he say it to the Klingons? We don't know. They certainly never mentioned that he did. Instead, there's a melodramatic thing where he puts humanity on trial. Now, Q appearing out of nowhere, and Q putting humanity on trial in a courtroom. If Gene Roddenberry's hands are on that, then either he really likes the motif and was trying to build a little continuity between this and the original show, or he was getting forgetful, because that is the Squire of Gothos. The original series episode, The Squire of Gothos, the Enterprise encounters an energy being who calls himself Trelane, who is able to teleport to warp space and time, to change mind frames, to harm or freeze people, to set up force fields, that sort of thing, and who puts Jim Kirk on trial. He puts the Enterprise, and by extension humanity, on trial. That episode is wrapped up very neatly. Q is not wrapped up very neatly. He shows up, he has this kind of melodramatic confrontation with Picard, sets up a kind of dialogue with Picard that continues throughout the whole series, and then just recently into Star Trek Picard. But it's only, even David Gerrold can only do so much with connecting it with the other plot line of the story. In other words, it's a mess. An absolute mess. And I would argue that in the book and also the first episode of the show are a mess at doing what the first episode of the show should do, which is to introduce us to the world and the characters. That barely happens at all. Barely at all. The Enterprise D is sent off by Admiral McCoy, by Bones McCoy, who's well north of 100 years old. He has simply lived the whole length of time between the original series and The Next Generation. He's a very, very old man. Still able to walk on his own. Still compos mentis, but well over 100 years old. So we know that there's at least one survivor, which automatically makes you wonder, well, what about other survivors? You know, if we say that people are living longer in the 23rd and 24th century, and if, for instance, Uhura was in her late 20s in the original show, maybe her mid 50s in the late movies, then is she around? Is Chekhov? Chekhov was a young man in the original show. Is he around? Spock has a very long life that got extremely lengthened by being totally reborn in the Genesis effect. I seem to remember, I've never actually gone back, and I'm sure that the text of the episode has been amended, but I seem to remember in one early first season episode of Star Trek The Next Generation, we are told that Kirk and Spock disappeared. That they disappeared. I feel certain I remember that even that word was used. Now, I don't know if that's been just removed. People don't talk about it anymore. If it was there, and I am remembering correctly, then that would be a drastic continuity flub along the lines of an original series episode, I believe it's The Conscience of the King, where McCoy and Spock are talking. McCoy's having a convivial drink and asks Spock if he wants to join him, and Spock says, my people never discovered the benefits of alcohol, and McCoy says, no wonder they were conquered. Now that line is in a lot of the prints of the original series that you can still see, but it has no possible part. It makes no sense in the Star Trek continuity that followed it, any more than Kirk and Spock disappearing makes any sense in light of what we know later in the continuity of the show, where Mr. Spock has certainly not disappeared. And Kirk, as far as everybody knows, died. He didn't disappear, he died saving the Enterprise C. Or B, or whatever it is. I think one of Roddenberry's ideas in setting this so far in the future, he could have said it 30 years in the future, but he doesn't. It's 100 years in the future. The technology really hasn't changed enough to my liking. Look at the technology. It's 2021 now. Look at the technology of 1921. It's unrecognizable. The normal things, the normal pieces of technology that you have in your life, there wasn't anything like them in 1921. There were no analogs. There was nothing like it at all. And yet, the crew is still using corridors. They're still walking to meetings. They still use automatic doors. They still have handheld phasers. They still have handheld data pads. None of the technology seems to have advanced 100 years. I think Roddenberry's main goal in setting it that far in the future was specifically so that it wouldn't be the stepchild of the original show, so that he could write on a blank canvas. I think it was only later that the showrunners for The Next Generation realized that all of the original fans of the show really want to know. They want to see some old favorites come back. No matter what you have to do it, they want to see that. Those old fans had a bit of adjusting to do for this new show, as did I. One of the things that I remember saying to the TV when I was watching the first episode of The Next Generation was, I was not a fan of the Enterprise. I was a fan of the people on board the Enterprise. You giving me an Enterprise and filling it with strangers doesn't help at all. Am I supposed to care about these people? I don't. I don't at all. I don't think in the first few episodes, in the first few seasons of Star Trek The Next Generation, I don't think much effort was made to make me care about these people. And none is in the book. David Gerald, I shouldn't be starting with this novel. It's not satisfying at all. It's as scatterbrained and poorly paced as the show that it is adapting. Gerald is adapting a script here. So I am not definitely going to judge either The Next Generation or the novels of The Next Generation by this. But I wanted to start with this as our first book for Book Trek 2021 in September. I'm not going to read The Next Generation novels in order, in order of publication. Not a chance. I'm going to move well away from this one to novels that were written once the show had got its feet underneath it. I'm no expert on Star Trek The Next Generation. If so many people over so many years, including some of my co-hosts for this event, are telling me that the show really doesn't come into its own for a few seasons, then maybe I will take that at their word and just not hold it to account. And I'll move later on. I don't actually, despite this, what some of you have said about Book Trek 2021, I don't actually want to read bad novels every night. So I don't know. I'm once again going to use the same tactic that I've used all through August. I'm going to quickly and randomly pick the book I'm going to read tonight. So I don't know what I'm going to talk about tomorrow, but it won't be the next book after Encounter at Farpoint. I just wanted to make this video to sort of orient us as to where we are. We have moved a century into the future, and we have a totally different crew whose backstory we don't know, whose interaction with each other we don't know, and whose capabilities we don't know. So we'll see what novelists can do about that. I'll find out tonight what book I'm going to read. I'll read it tonight, and I'll report back tomorrow. Thank you, BookTube.